Hello there. Today's video is about a particular battle, in this case Forum Gallorum from April 43 BC. Now, we talked about the eyewitness account from Sulpicius Galba, one of the officers on the senatorial side, for want of a better term, in this Roman civil war, and his letter to Cicero, where he gives a remarkably detailed eyewitness account of this battle written within a day of the events occurring. And obviously that's very, very rare in a Roman context. These sorts of things have not, in the main, survived. We know they existed at the time, but they haven't come through to us. So partly today's talk is to look in more detail at that battle. So it links in with that discussion of that account and also what Roman officers did in battles in this period. It's going to fit in more broadly with some of the themes we'll develop on this channel on YouTube. So I want to do a series on individual battles. We've started that a little bit and we'll continue to do so. I'm not going to do them in chronological order or anything like that. We're going to flit about as the mood takes me. So partly that's to look at particular battles, mostly but not exclusively from the ancient world, and try and see whether we can see something new from the sources, something a little bit unfamiliar even for those who may have thought about them before. Obviously, in the case of Forum Gallorum, it's not a Cannae, it's not a Pharsalus, it's not an Alesia, it's not an Adrianople. It's not one of these still fairly famous encounters, and it does not decide even this phase of the Civil War. It plays an important role and matters develop from this, but the victors end up splitting up, in particular after this, and Cicero will be talking with great enthusiasm about the victory, about the heroism of the soldiers involved. Will have cause to regret some of the decisions that he encouraged and made in the aftermath of this battle. So in itself, Forum Gallorum isn't as famous as many of the actions we'll cover elsewhere. We did the talk on Waterloo not too long ago on the 18th of June. And we'll look at Cannae and a lot of other ancient battles that, as I say, are better known than this, and often larger than this. Forum Gallorum was not an exceptionally big battle. It's a decent sized action, but it wasn't massive. You have maybe 30,000 on one side, fewer than that, 20,000 or less, and those are highest estimates for the numbers involved. It's probably smaller. So all in all, you're talking 50,000 men or so, and probably considerably fewer were engaged in this, whereas the Roman losses at Cannae, Roman and Italian losses, are on that scale. So partly it will fit in with this consideration of battles in history, and we'll have a playlist about those, but it helps us to think about how we understand and study the Roman army, particularly at a transitional period like this. We're in 43 BC. We've had Caesar's campaigns decade or so before, and only a few years before in the case of the Civil War, for which we have his commentaries about Gaul, about the Civil War campaigns, that give us greater detail about a Roman army on campaign than we get anywhere else in surviving ancient literature. And they're written by, in the case of most of the books, Caesar himself, so the commander of one of the sides. Obviously there are problems with that, but nevertheless he's in a position to know a lot of things that other authors would not. It's the extra books are continued by officers involved, including one of the commanders at Forum Gallorum, Hirtius, the consul of that year. So you have that army that's very familiar from the commentaries and from some other sources, and then we have the army of the Principate, the army that's shaped by Augustus and turns into that very recognizable Roman army that will build bases that are immediately identifiable as Roman military installations in a way that earlier ones are. It's a little harder. There's a neatness, it's not quite exact uniformity, but there is a similarity in the way the army acts, the way the army is organized, the equipment it uses, the things it builds, for the next few centuries, and there will be changes. So the army of the Principate is very familiar. This is a little bit before. We're looking at an army in transition, and it's worth asking questions, because sometimes we tend to assume that there's almost a switch that's flicked, and then you've gone from the Polybian Legion to the Marian Legion to the Legion of the Principate without anything in between, and it's all automatic and it's all instant, instead of something that develops rather more gradually in some respects, but sporadically. You know, there are certain periods of reform, but there are also just changes in the way things are organised, how it's recruited, who's involved, how the officers work, all this sort of thing. So we're coming to the end at this time of the very well documented period of 1st century BC Roman history, and before that you've got Polybius and people for 2nd century and earlier, Livy. And you're moving into the period of the Principate, where the archaeology, the epigraphy vastly increases. You get far, far more of that, because this is a permanent force that marks itself out as different from the rest of the population in so many ways, visible ways. But at the same time, it's when the literary sources will begin to fade away. You have some for the 1st century AD, you know, you've got Dio, but often as an epitome. You've got Tacitus for parts of the Julio-Claudians, and then up until AD 70, but not after that. And then these huge gaps, you know, you're really jumping on to, you've got Herodian, more of Dio in the early 3rd century, but there are issues with a lot of those, and then you're jumping to Ammianus in the 4th century, before you get detailed accounts of the Roman army operating, the Roman army on campaign, that can compare to Caesar's commentaries, to this earlier stuff, even to Tacitus in his fullest moments. There are these huge gaps, and it's a question of survival, not of what originally existed. So we'll also, through this, be thinking about the Roman army. We'll be thinking about different accounts of an action and how we should understand these, how we should assess these. We'll be thinking about some of the themes raised in Galba's letter about what are the officers doing, what are the role, and how do officers and men interact, how do the troops behave, what's the decisive factor in these encounters. And obviously this is a Roman army fighting another Roman army. We're in civil war country here. So all of these things are different, but it tells us something about the Roman army that adds to our understanding and reminds us that even though the period from Caesar to the sort of full establishment of the Augustan regime and the Augustan Principate is short for us, it's a couple of decades, and then much of what we can see in Augustus's reign of how the army is doing things will carry on through for the next 200 years or so, particularly in the layout of barrack blocks and bases and this sort of thing. And even in many ways, barring some of the details, a lot of the equipment and the organisation, the creation of the professional auxiliary, all that sort of thing. Things I've touched on in other videos elsewhere, and we'll no doubt talk about more. So we have to be careful when we come to 43 BC, when we come to a campaign in the Civil War fought just over a year after Caesar's assassination, between Mark Antony, Caesar's fellow consul, in 44 BC, and someone who has rallied considerable numbers of Caesar's former supporters to his cause, who's in many ways trying to appear as the sort of heir to that. It's dangerous to use words like party or faction in these contexts, but of that body of support, people who'd backed Caesar and very angry when Caesar was murdered and didn't believe the conspirators were right, against, in this particular battle, none of the major conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, Decimus Brutus, are not involved, but we do have Galba there, who was one of the assassins. So this is a campaign fought by the consuls of 43, Hirtius and Pansa, supported by the private army of Octavianus, the young Caesar, call him what you will, against Mark Antony. So you have men who have formerly been loyal to Julius Caesar on both sides, because you have the principal heir in Caesar's will, the man who's claimed that this means adoption, or the youngster really, he's still only in his teens at this point, joining with the forces appointed by the Senate, the legitimate government, though obviously in situations like this everything is a little bit messy, to say the least. But Hirtius and Pansa are the consuls of the year. They have decided to fight against Mark Antony. They have an army of freshly raised troops, and again we'll come on to all the composition. So we won't go into too much detail into the politics, that's a very big story, and well, I've covered a little bit elsewhere, but we'll probably do more at some point. Certainly if you want more, go and look at my biography of Augustus or the Antony and Cleopatra, both of which cover this in considerable detail. And we'll give you references to works that will take you even further. So things are changing. The Roman army of this time is starting to have more of an epigraphic presence. They're setting up inscriptions. You've got the big program of establishing veteran colonies that has begun under Caesar, is continuing at this point, where you are settling down soldiers, often with former comrades, often with the officers that have commanded them in the army, the centurions, the tribunes, becoming the aristocracy of these new communities, or these reorganized communities where you've added veterans into an existing settlement and confiscated land and given it to them. So we've got that, again, it's a sign of what's coming, but in terms of sheer quantity, it's far less than what will happen under Augustus and certainly later on under the Principate. So again, it comes back to this army in transition and how we understand that. Galba's letter, as I mentioned in the other video, is unique. We don't have anything comparable written by one of the senior officers in an army the day after a battle, describing it in this level of detail. You get occasional mentions, but there's not much. We know there was far more that once existed, and occasionally Plutarch and others will cite letters written by participants, but only very briefly. We don't get the details. So we know more was around, but it's not there. It's got inherent problems, as we talked about before. It's obviously very much presents a favourable view of the author. He's writing and he's getting in his version quickly so that Cicero and everybody important in the Senate knows that he played a significant role in the victory that's just occurred. It's paralleled by an account in Appian's civil war, which gives us quite a detailed account of the overall battle that has similarities but differs in significant ways from Galba's account. Not enough to make us think that we have to reject either, but they are describing from a different point of view. Who Appian's sources were hard to say. Asinius Pollio is obviously a prime candidate. His history that he was one of Caesar's officers, particularly in the Civil War period, stood aloof at Actium, though he was getting on a bit by then, wrote a highly respected history, none of which has survived. You get these mentions that he said this, but that's it. Pollio wasn't there. Pollio was in Spain when the battle was fought, so he wasn't an eyewitness, but he would have known most of the key participants. He would have known the army, known the system, had chance to gather evidence from these sources, would have the records. But we don't know. It's guesswork that Pollio is behind this. There is a tendency that goes back to the old ideas of source criticism, that the idea you could sort of mine the surviving source to get to its original text, the original sources of information used by that author, and then based on your opinion of these people decide whether it was valid or not. It's obviously something done in a big way for Alexander the Great and people like that, where everything that survives is so much later. As a technique, I have considerable doubts about it because there are so many assumptions on which you pile more assumptions. You are very much building a house of cards, and if you knock out any of them, then the whole thing's going to fall down. So there is a chance that people like Appian, certainly they did have access to Asinius Pollio, that they used that, they used reliable accounts, but again, it becomes difficult, and I think it is best to take the authors we have on their own merits and decide this is Appian, this is Dio, this is an epitome of Dio, this is Suetonius, whatever it might be, rather than trying to say, well, they're really just parroting somebody else. Because having written a lot myself, yes, you use sources, that's part of the job, but also your writing style changes certainly over the years and months, but even day to day. You can write something one week and you will use the same expression or a similar one again and again because it's just in your mind, which a month later you wouldn't do. And to identify that as two different authors. I can read my own stuff written decades ago and think, well, it could have been written by anybody. I don't recognize it. And so I think it's a very tempting approach in that it says, oh, we can narrow it down and we can say, well, this person had a good source who was actually there, and that's all it's come through in its entirety, in its essential honesty and integrity as well into the source we have, and therefore we rely on it. We don't. I just don't believe it. It's not as anywhere near as precise as that. And it's something I think, generally speaking, that's less true now of particularly Romanists. I think in some aspects of Greek history that tradition still continues, particularly the Alexander side, because it's hard to avoid it. And you get it in New Testament studies and that sort of thing. But I generally think that while it's interesting to think about, it doesn't really take you as far as many of the protagonists feel it does. Anyway, that's going into approach. And so you've got these two detailed accounts of the battle, and that's quite rare. And even though Appian's is written, a century later, he had access to some sources, so it's not entirely out of the air. And there are details in there that do strike you as likely to be accurate, certainly as plausible. Now, obviously, you've got to be careful with that, but nevertheless, it's encouraging. So you've got those sources. You've also got one of the interesting things. Cicero comments on the battle in letters, in speeches, and so you're getting a reaction to a civil war battle, and it's surprising how enthusiastic, how positive he is about the Roman troops involved on his side, the winning side, the Senate side, as he would see it. So he talks about the losses, for the flower and blossom of our soldiers have perished. And as later on we'll see, he recommends honours to the fallen and their dependents, their families, and this sort of thing, it's unusual. So there are some striking differences that do remind us that this again is not the army of the Principate that's fully professional, that's less and less recruited from Italy and tends to serve and live and settle after service away from Italy, away from Rome, nearer the frontiers. So again, that's maybe not quite as simple as we might think. There are probably more connections that between soldiers, and it may be that the apparent absence of Italians in the legions from the later 1st century AD is a fault of our sources and the types of information, rather than necessarily a full reflection of what's going on. But that's again a topic for another day. So let's remind ourselves a little bit about Galba as a source before we come back. We've talked about him in detail, but let's just remind ourselves, for those who haven't watched that video, and to keep this as coherent as possible. So Galba had served in Gaul under Julius Caesar. He'd then served under Caesar in the Civil War. He was praetor in 54 BC, so that's during the Gallic campaign. So he's one of those people who is in Gaul for a bit, but also is following his political career in Rome. It's like Cicero's brother Quintus. Quite a lot of Caesar's officers come out for a while, do the equivalent of a sort of tour or two, but have political aspirations. Mark Antony, who'll figure heavily on our story, is of course a prime candidate. He's there briefly, then goes back for election. He returns as quaestor, goes back, seeks election to the tribunate, returns to the army, and so on. Because they're Roman politicians. These are Roman public figures for whom military service is part of their career, but it's not the whole of their career. You're climbing the political ladder through adding laurels to your reputation, adding to your reputation, and also gaining money as part of the spoils. The share as a senior officer is pretty good, and getting the backing of people like Caesar and centurions on leave who can vote in the higher centuries of the Comitia Centuriata, that sort of thing. So he's back and forth. He stood for the consulship for 49 BC, so that's in the build-up to the Civil War, and fails to get elected. And obviously that's a pretty volatile time. And he didn't get it later. So he becomes one of the conspirators in 44 BC. He's there on the Ides of March. He's one of the men who stabs Julius Caesar. So this is someone like Decimus Brutus, who's had a pretty good career under Caesar, done very well, been seen very much as one of Caesar's partisans, has stuck with Caesar through the Civil War, and fought for him then, but then decides that we can't have a dictator, or turns against him for whatever reasons. So he's condemned as one of the conspirators. His eventual fate isn't quite clear. None of them live to a ripe old age, but we don't quite know what the details are of him. So he's one of our big sources, and we'll come back to his account and we'll look at that in Appian as we go along. Let's think about the army though first, before we move on to that. So again, one day we'll do a more detailed thing on Marius and the Marian reforms and the different interpretations around this. Generally speaking, the old view, to simplify things, that Marius came in, and before that the army consisted of citizens of property serving because of their obligation, their duty to the state, and men of property, men of some substance, some of whom were suffering because of prolonged military service. And that then is switched. Marius recruits the Capiticensi, the poorer citizens, the ones who don't have that property qualification but are willing to take on the army as a career. And then there's this idea, suddenly you've gone from a sort of amateur army, a militia army, a conscript army, to a professional one. Like that. Now, most people don't believe the change is as abrupt, as drastic as that. So it's a more gradual change, but there is certainly lots of problems. There's lots we don't understand about the army of the 1st century BC. It's clearly, you've only got to look at Caesar and his account of how it operates. It is different, the emphasis on the cohort, for instance, over the maniple, compared to Polybius's day. And the legions with Caesar are semi-permanent. We don't really know about length of service and exactly how things worked. You know, there's this old idea that comes through in the initial Augustan reform that 16 years was the maximum period of service. You could be asked as a citizen to serve for that period, but they couldn't demand more than that. 16 years or possibly 16 campaigns if they didn't last as long as a year. Augustus will establish 16 and 4 as a veteran, and then eventually extend that to 20 and 5 as a veteran to get the 25 years of service that's familiar to us from the army of the Principate. There's no sign that people are serving as long as that, at least in one go, at this point, but they do seem to be serving for longer. So, longer than the past. They're not just calling up for one campaign, dismissed at the end of it. Or at least a lot of people, even if they're moving from one legion to another. Remember as well, Julius Caesar takes over 4 legions in his provinces that have already been raised by other people, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and then raises 11 and 12 and so on after that. So units that have been raised by one governor will continue to serve under successors. And that's happened before, but it seems more common now. Now, if you look at the classic study of this period, and either side really, Lawrence Kepes, The Making of the Roman Army, he tentatively suggested that 6 years might be the sort of period that people are signing up for at this time. 7 years has also been put forward. I think Brunt in Italian Manpower, again, one of those very important studies. Both of them are getting on a bit now, but they stand up remarkably well, even if new evidence, new interpretation means we're not going to accept, we'll change some of the details, as is the way of these things. So Kepes suggests that maybe you signed up for 6 years as a rule, but you could be asked for 16. You can still be conscripted, you can still be called up. Cicero, when he's governor of Cilicia in 50 BC, talks about, well, he had the option of conscripting Roman citizens active in the province, but he didn't think there were enough that were able to do. At one point, Mark Antony, early on in his career, a few years before that, commands a sort of scratch force of Roman traders, Roman settlers who've been conscripted in Syria and in Judea and that area. So that's still there. It's possible that there was some variation. We get, for instance, in 51 to 50 BC, in the build-up to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in January 49 BC, the build-up to the Civil War, one of the issues that's raised by Caesar's opponents is that some of his soldiers are either due for discharge, the end of their service, or even overdue for discharge. And it's one of these, it's brought up as an issue to weaken Caesar, to deplete his armies. We don't know the details, we don't know the numbers. Some seem to be officers, but we're also talking about rank and file. So that suggests that you've signed up under these terms and you're obliged to serve for a set period, and that you can know this is when that period has expired, and therefore I should be due for discharge and go back into civilian life. We might be making a mistake if we assume there's one system and that everybody signs up under exactly the same terms. Because you could look at, say, the British Army in the late 18th, early 19th century, when you might sign your life away and basically sign up for indefinite service, or you could sign up for 7 years. given that Roman armies are generally organized by somebody who's been appointed as governor and is forming them to go out to a province at their initial stage, they have to appeal. They try and attract recruits, they try and attract officers, so there may be an element of trying to give a sort of favourable version of normal service terms to attract people, particularly to an unpopular campaign or under an unpopular commander. He still needs soldiers. Somebody needs to go. So it might be that there's more than one system. You feel with Augustus, a lot of what he does with the army is to regularize things and establish this is how we will do it. This is the system, this is what's going on, so from now on everything will happen this way. And this is the regulation, whether it comes to, you can see it in laying out a camp, as I mentioned before. Suddenly everything is much more uniform. Again, not quite identical, but so close that it's hard to tell the difference. Equipment gets more standardized, organization, all of these things come through, and he's not starting from a clean slate, starting from scratch. He's basically institutionalizing best practice up until now, probably with some bright ideas, some innovations as well, and advice from others. So might well be the probability is you enlist for a campaign, or perhaps you enlist for so many years, and it might be that different men within the same unit have enlisted under different terms. You can think back to the Continentals in the Revolutionary War, Union Army in the Civil War, where some people have signed different papers, and the whole thing with the attack on Trenton and everything is that Washington is doing this before a lot of his men really could choose to go home, because they've come to the end of the period they promised to serve. Now, obviously, in a civil war, that's going to be even more likely, because then you're very desperate for recruits, and then you're promising bounties and money and bonuses and all this sort of thing. So you have as well, and they feature here, they feature elsewhere, evocati, recalled veterans, former soldiers, former officers who've agreed to serve again. So they've already completed one contract with presumably the res publica, the state, even though it's represented by a particular commander, and they are now taking on another one. They're willing to do so, but because of their status, because they've already completed their obligation to the Senate and people of Rome, then they're under different terms and usually higher pay privileges, this sort of thing. You also have, remember the frequent cries for discharge, for demobilization, that you get during the civil wars. You have with Caesar, you have several mutinies, as they're often called, the 9th Legion at one point, the 10th Legion famously, that's the one when Caesar gets up before them and addresses them as quirites rather than commilitones, citizens rather than fellow soldiers, comrades, and the whole thing sort of dies down. Also demands for promised bounties, promised rewards, the things that a general said, on those desperate occasions, oh yeah, if you stick with me, if you, stay the course in this campaign, then I'll give you this, I'll give you that. People do make these demands, so there is a contractual element to this, and there is a feeling that people know where they stand, that soldiers have a sense of, this is what we were promised, these are the terms on which we enlisted, you have to deliver this back to us, we only serve for this period, whatever it might be. Now those might be subject to negotiation. You might be able to change it, okay, we will serve a bit longer, but we sure want that money, but it isn't as simple, the state just calls your name, they deliver a message to your house, basically you're in the army now for so many years and your rights are gone. Because again, remember, these are citizen soldiers. There is still a strong sense of that ideal, whoever the soldiers are now, that you serve out of duty to the Senate and people of Rome. So it's interesting as well, think back to Caesar mentions, and some of the other sources mention, men going on leave to Italy during the course of the Gallic campaigns in the 50s, and particularly being significant at elections. Now, again, in the Rome, the HBO drama series we've talked about before, what he sends back are, people like, Vorenus goes to Centurion, but you get Pullo and others who are basically there as thugs to intimidate the thugs hired by the other side in elections and this sort of thing. There's probably part of that, that might be part of it. That's generally the way scholars tend to assume. However, I think because there is this oversimplification of Roman society, and we tend to lump centurions, even tribunes, in to an extent with everybody else in the army, and forget that these are men, simply by the pay they're getting and the status they're getting as centurions, are men of considerable status and wealth, but many of them may have started out that way as well. So you have men who will vote in one of the more restricted, one of the voting groups within the Comitia Centuriata, which is based around property assessment in the census, vote in the significant centuries that tend to have a major role in deciding who's going to win the consulship, for instance, and other magistracies. So it probably makes more sense to think actually what you do is send on furlough a lot of your officers, because they are men of significant political clout, particularly collectively. If you start to have enough to influence enough groups within the comitia, then you can start to have a bigger influence than simply just having a gang of bully boys that can intimidate potential opponents or real opponents. There's a lot of other aspects about the army we don't understand this time, so these are things I can come back to elsewhere, but I just want to raise some of these questions. So often we assume we know everything about the Roman army, it's all fairly simple, and the more you look at it, the more puzzles there are. There are some things we know, there's a lot of data, but there's nowhere near as much as we need, and there are aspects, there are periods like this that fall between how we think we understand the Polybian, an earlier Republican army, and how we think we understand the army of the Principate. This army in transition is much harder to define because there are many things where there's simply no evidence, and we're just guessing and we're trying to think, well, this is what they've done before, we think, or this is what they're doing later on, so what might they be doing at this stage? We know very little about training. Suetonius goes on about how Julius Caesar was very conscious of the need to train troops, and that's a theme in most ancient literature, that the best commanders, particularly the best Roman commanders, are the ones who train their men thoroughly before battle. But Suetonius talks about the rigor of the training and going through it. Elsewhere Plutarch will talk about Pompey and the civil war, training with his men, setting an example. In Caesar's case, Suetonius tells the stories of these route marches where he'd give the order, you've got to follow me, basically, and then he'd slip out of camp and lead them on a route march during a festival or bad weather, get them out there, but set an example, but also toughening them up. So we get glimpses of training, but we don't really know how it all worked, how often it occurs. There isn't much evidence for units, once they're raised, recruiting to top up their numbers. May have happened, we don't really get a lot of evidence for it. So whether you ever had to train individual small groups to go and reinforce one of these units, and if so, where did you do it? Again, these are questions we don't know. The army as well, from Cicero, for instance, we discover that troops could sometimes be billeted in cities, in private houses. His predecessor there had extorted money from communities not to have soldiers billeted on them. Now, whether this was simply because whenever you put the soldiers there, things got a bit lively at night, or they were inclined to throw their weight about because they were, after all, representatives of the imperial power, or whether this is something where he could actually tell them, well, go in and smash things up, and it's effectively a protection racket, do you want these, because I can tell them to be nasty, whereas if you give me this nice payment as a nice gift, completely unsolicited, all this sort of thing, it'll be fine, you won't have to deal with that. But you also get the winter quarters of Caesar. Now, in Gaul, obviously, there are not the number of cities and urban areas that you have in North Africa and the East, some other regions, parts of Spain even. You do have the Opita, and sometimes there are troops apparently stationed, at least in small detachments in these, but not as a whole. On the whole, Caesar's legions build their own camps, their own winter quarters, and stay there until called out again for the next campaign. But again, there's lots of practices like this that have, again, you can see earlier roots to it, and we can see where it's going with Augustus and those permanent bases, but we don't quite know where we are here, and there may well have been a lot of variation between different armies. When we come to look at the legions themselves, they're quite hard to trace, because although there's a move towards permanence, we shouldn't anticipate this. Again, the difference, we telescope this, oh, well, we're in the 40s, by the 20s, Augustus, late 20s, Augustus is putting together the professional army, the permanent army, and it'll last, some of these legions will last then for centuries. And some of the ones around now seem to have the same names and numbers as some of the Augustan ones and will continue on for that period. But again, it's a jump. Remember, 20 years or so, when you're looking back from our perspective 2,000 years on, doesn't seem like a long time. But in terms of real life, it is a very long time, and a lot can happen in that period. There's certainly a strong sense of identity within the legions, and it's marked in the accounts we have, Galba's letter, Appian's account, Cicero, and elsewhere, as it is in Caesar. It's also the way they record themselves in colonies. You're starting to get inscriptions where people are saying, we are men from this legion, we have settled here. And you're starting to get that epigraphic record where people are commemorating themselves as soldiers, or as former soldiers, or as former officers, in a way in the earlier generations you didn't, because being a soldier was simply part of being a citizen. So you didn't need to state that. Everybody knew, and you didn't need to emphasize it. The process of colonization, of demobilizing the armies that had fought the civil wars under Caesar. Remember, the Munda campaign is only finished in 45, so that's 2 years, slightly less than 2 years before Forum Gallorum we're talking about now. Again, this is a fairly brief break in civil wars. We don't know how quickly that had been happening. Again, it comes back to how many men were already due for discharge, how many were given early discharge because they weren't needed anymore, how many were choosing to continue to serve. Caesar had been forming this big army to go out and fight the Parthians in the expedition that he never got to lead. So we don't quite know, but there are clearly established colonies from which new units can be recruited, or old units can be reformed. Men are willing to come from these and serve. Now that's a reminder as well. It comes back to this point about the length of service being shorter. If you joined the army at 18 and you'd served for 25 years as you would under the Principate, then you're 43 before you're demobilized. That's getting on a bit to be recruited into the army again if there's an emergency. On the other hand, if we're talking about service of 6 years, 7 years, this sort of thing, or even for the duration of campaign, many of the colonists, many of the veterans, as they are called, could be men in late 20s, early 30s. So a degree of the time that the Romans consider the prime of life. So particularly good military material added to the experience they've already got as well. But they're still fairly fit. And in many cases, they haven't been out of the army quite as long. There's a difference between, there's lots of those interesting reports on the Korean War when many Second World War veterans were recalled as reservists, both by the US Army and by the British Army, and the emphasis where they had to relearn a lot of the skills they'd known because they'd been out for 5 years or more. That sort of period, they'd been living a normal life. I suppose the old, there's that Bridge to Tokari, isn't it, the William Holden, Grace Kelly film, where again he's, I think, become a doctor or something, it's called back to be a Navy pilot. It's Did I say Grace Kelly is the wife? Should have said anyway. I don't know. But how often do you get to mention Grace Kelly and William Holden in a talk about 43 BC? It's got to be. You've got to make the effort when you can. Anyway, in the civil war that we're looking at, in the 44-43 BC campaign, it's a very mixed bag of quality of the troops involved, and that is emphasized again and again in the sources, that how experienced they were really made a difference. Now, Caesar's army had expanded in Gaul. We've talked about this in more detail elsewhere, so I won't go through it again. And then during the Civil War, even more rapidly, because not only are you recruiting people to boost your armies, and people like Curio will lead off expeditions to Sicily, to North Africa, and doesn't end up very well, but also when you defeat the enemy, you capture lots of former Pompeian soldiers. What do you do with them? The best thing, the simplest thing is and safest thing is to recruit them, make them serve you, try and build up their loyalty, because you don't want to just send them home and they might go and rejoin the next Pompeian army to form. And also you have to treat them reasonably well because they're citizens. You can't just go around massacring people and all this sort of thing. And particularly for Caesar, who's based his whole propaganda, his whole public image on his clemency, and this reluctance to fight and kill other Romans, of all classes, not just his own senatorial elite. So it's hard to trace which legions are still in existence, which ones are reformed, because numbers reappear. There's certainly prestige associated with a particular number, or in some cases a name. And that sense of identity is very, very strong. Obviously, it's a morale boost to the troops themselves, the sense that we are special, we are Legio Martia, we are Legio 7, we are 5th Alaudi, and we've won before and we'll win again. And the sense of familiar. Now, just how many of the men came back to serve in some of these, and how many that were new recruits in units that had been around for a while, another matter. But there's obviously a hard core that reinforced that strong sense of corporate identity. And you get prestige from commanding these famous units, but you also get prestige from commanding lots of troops and lots of legions. So there is the tendency you've always had in civil wars to raise a lot of legions so that you can say, I've got 12 legions, even if they're only at half strength, rather than I've got 8 legions that are nearly at full strength, or 6 legions that are at full strength. It sounds more impressive. So the power of names is quite significant. You've got 5th Alaudi that will serve under Mark Antony. Alaudi means the larks. It's an unusual form of the name, and that's like, you have all the spellings of Welsh. At various times the Royal Regiment of Wales, Welsh Regiment, Fusiliers have done things their own way. So sometimes you get Welsh with a C, W-E-L-C-H. The British Army is incredibly tribal and always has been, and emphasises these little distinctions. Other armies might not take it to that extreme, but an awful lot of people, there is a tendency, we're special because we're this particular group and we know each other. It's a very human thing, and it does seem to work very well. So you get, even when it's unofficial, lots of things that will stress your particular identity, your belonging to this group, and then you'll get the official attempts to create this as well, some of which work, some of which don't. Now, possibly the origins of 5th Alaudi are in the 20-plus cohorts that Caesar is supposed to have recruited from Transalpine Gaul, not Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul. They appear to operate as cohorts. And when initially raised, he doesn't raise 2 legions, perhaps because he's raising in an area where he wants them to get citizenship, but most people don't have it. So these are not Roman citizens when they're enlisted, although there's clearly a significant Roman influence on the local culture. Transalpine Gaul has been a province now for since the last quarter of the 2nd century BC, so it's a couple of generations. And some of he singles out officers, noblemen, several of them Roman citizens within the Gallic commentaries as distinguished men, treats them with respect. And Caesar he's championed the cause of citizenship for Cisalpine Gaul. He will do the same for Transalpine Gaul. So possibly they're turned into a legion around about 51 BC. They appear in the Civil War. They're not mentioned in the Gallic commentaries as a legion. So it appears to come later, but again, you always have to be careful when something is mentioned for the first time. Doesn't mean that's when it actually comes into existence. No source tells us this legion is formed at that time. They're prominent at the Battle of Thapsus, do rather well there. They help defeat the Pompeian elephants, that sort of thing. Now let's look at Cicero. We'll anticipate a little bit. It's interesting how they're presented, because on the one hand, they are clearly proud of this distinctive identity and the sense that they are Gallic. They have, the larks, does it come from some incident? Does it come from some nickname? Does it come from a type of crest, lark's feathers, something like that? We're not quite sure. There's no indication of what this is about. But, sorry, where am I going to find that? Yeah, here we go. So let's look at 44 BC, 2nd of November. One of Cicero's letters to Atticus. And he talks about how Cacina brought news that Antony is making for Rome with the Legio Alaudi, raising a forced contribution from towns and marching with his soldiers in formed bodies, or under the standards, basically, is how it's, Signa becomes shorthand for, literally means standards, but it does seem to mean battle line, organised units. It can sort of be extended more generally, in the sense of a formal army. I think that's a formal army, a formal formation, rather than just literally decorations on a pole. So in November, it's interesting that Cicero singles out Legio Alaudi, and he will continue to do so. And one of the reasons probably is the peculiar origin of this, because the units form not in Italy of Roman citizens, but formed in Transalpine Gaul, initially of non-citizens, so they may have been granted citizenship by this time by Caesar, or subsequently by Antony. Then there's a sense that, well, these are a bit foreign. So I don't like Mark Antony. Mark Antony I'm trying to present as the most dangerous threat to the state and to stability and to the res publica. I hate the man, he's dangerous. This is, the time when Cicero will be delivering the Philippics, these speeches modelled on Demosthenes' speeches against Philip II of Macedonia, and their character assassination of Mark Antony, and very thorough ones at that. Just before this, September, again in the Philippics, in the first version, he's again starting to attack Mark Antony, and he raises the question of juries. Who's going to compose the juries in the major courts of the Roman system? We'll talk about trials and jury composition another day. It's a really big political football from the Gracchi onwards, until it's finally settled with, should it be senators, should it be equestrians, should it be this tribuni aerari, this third group that appear that we know less about. But anyway, Antony was proposing something, Cicero didn't approve of it. Cicero's presenting Antony as trying to rig the courts. So, what of this third panel on a jury? Of centurions, he says, that's Antony. What? Were not judicial functions open to that class by the Julian law, also before that by the Pompeian, by the Aurelian? This is the tribuni aerari and equestrians being included in the thing. The assumption means that some centurions have the census qualification to be equestrians probably, but even more this sort of next down group, the tribuni aerari. The reply, a property qualification was prescribed, says he, but not for a centurion alone, also for a Roman knight. Accordingly, men of the greatest valour and integrity who have been in command still act as jurors and have hitherto acted. So Cicero is saying, well, aren't the best centurions already eligible for jury service anyway, so what are you trying to do? And those are not the men I'm looking for, he says. Let everyone who's been in command act as judge. I'm not asking for such qualifications, and I will add jurors, rancors, manipularis, there's maniple men of the Legio Alaudi. Now, obviously, we don't know how faithfully Cicero is representing what Antony's saying at this point, but note the implication. First of all, the centurions who already serve on juries are the decent chaps who have a high property census qualification, so they're equites tribuni aerari. Antony wants to extend that some centurions have that, but not all, to anybody who's commanded. Then he's saying, well, I'm going to put ordinary soldiers from 5th Alaudi. But again, it's not one of the other legions, it's this legion of Gauls. You are presenting your enemy in the civil war as the leader of foreigners, of barbarians even. That's how the imagination would go. A lot of tall, fair-haired, psychotic Gauls, descendants of the people who sacked Rome centuries before. That's the sort of imagery that Cicero's trying to rake up. And the idea then, they're ordinary soldiers, they're not people who can understand these important things, they're not men of integrity and so on. We've got all the snobbery of his class, but it's interesting in what this is telling us about how, again, the emphasis that's a significant number of your centurions and above are already within this group that's bordering on the aristocracy, and that has a significant political role within the court system, but that Antony wants to extend this. That's what he's being accused of. So you have, again, and when there's talk of it, Cicero tends again and again to mention Alaudi, the Larks. That's the legion he talks about when he talks about Antony's soldiers, and it's presenting him. If you think back, Caesar, when he's describing the fighting in Spain in 49 BC, emphasises how the Pompeian legions there start to fight like the locals. They rush about, they don't keep formation. It's almost as if they're not being proper Romans in the way they behave. The Gabini, the legions that are in Egypt, that fight against him during the Alexandrian campaign, again he emphasises that they've gone native, they've taken local wives. These aren't really Romans anymore, is the reputation. It's always better to imply you're fighting against a load of foreigners, in the same way he emphasises the very broad range and numbers of allied troops and auxiliaries that Pompey has for the Macedonian campaign, and the idea of this army, well, they're not really true Romans, they're just a load of barbarians, a load of foreigners. So Cicero compares Julius Caesar to Hannibal in 49 BC. Again, same idea. This is a Roman consul, a Roman proconsul, but we're actually saying he's just like Hannibal. He's a foreign invader with a barbarian army coming. That's the danger. That's why we must oppose him. Virgil, when he talks about a barbarian soldier taking over his substantial family farm. So it's interesting that there are these images, and it's a theme that comes in, and obviously particularly for the better off, but perhaps more generally for a lot of Romans, for a lot of Italians, there was the sense that you could, you didn't like people who were different, who were outsiders, you were a bit suspicious of soldiers that you could perceive as foreign. And obviously somebody who's coming along has been given your farm when it's been confiscated for you, it's not going to be in your good books anyway. So so you have the negative image of Fifth Alaudi, and Cicero emphasizes it. He mentions the name a lot, and he mentions it more than it gets mentioned in the other sources. So Galba and Appian don't really talk about it very much at all, more generally. So it's, again, that's a rhetorical technique. He's picking on the sort of the foreign bit of Antony's army and Antony's supporters, and then from that emphasizing, well, these are dodgy, these are barbarians, this is yet another reason why it shows the true colours of this man. He's not a proper Roman, he's a foreign enemy. And it's easier to fight a civil war if you can portray the enemy as not really Roman, not really you. They are foreigners, they are dangerous in that respect. On the other hand, you get a much more positive image for Legio Martia. To some extent the fourth, but Legio Martia again has that sort of prominence. It does seem to have played the key role in the Battle of Forum Gallorum, as we've seen from Sulpicius Galba's account, but also it's Cicero singles it out. Now, it had come from the garrison of Macedonia. These are troops that have been sent by Caesar. They're part of the preparations for the war he'd planned in 44. He was about to set out on this when he gets murdered on the Ides of March, with campaign to the Danube, then a campaign against the Parthians. So they're an experienced unit. It's very hard to know where they come from, what their origins are. They're perceived and they're presented as veteran. And one advantage they had is that they have stayed in being. You get the veteran settlers who are encouraged to join, re-recruited, reformed some of the old legions of Caesar, but they've had a break from military service. Legio Martia, these people have been soldiers all the way through, so they've come. On the other hand, remember, you go back to Gallic Wars 8-8, where Hirtius, probably the author of that war, talks about the 11th Legion, Legio 11, serving in its 8th campaign, but it wasn't quite on a par with reputation and courage with the veteran 7th, 8th and 9th that are also taking part in these operations 51 BC. So there's that sense that it can take a long time to achieve the sort of the full veteran status, the reputation of some of these units. So again, it can be more experienced than others. It's possible that Valerius Maximus mentions Legio Martia. He talks about it when he's talking about Julius Caesar rallying troops by grabbing an eagle bearer, Aquilifer, and turning him round and saying, look, that's where the enemy are. A version of a story that's told in Plutarch, that's told in Appian, but without the legion mentioned. Valerius Maximus's version claims this is Legio Martia. The other stories are set in North Africa in the 46 BC campaign. So it could be that Legio Martia has been around by then and has actually served in several of the Civil War campaigns. But again, we don't know when it was formed. And we don't quite know whether it ever had a number or whether it takes on the name, Mars' own. It's a very good military one. So it could be one of the raw legions that formed 49, 48 BC, that period, particularly 48 BC when you've got Pompeian recruits as well coming over, Pompeian prisoners. So it's probably had some service in the Civil War, and it's been formally embodied and training up for the Parthian expedition. Remember Octavian is an Amphipolis in the same area to be educated, but also to gain some military experience before presumably accompanying Caesar on at least some of this campaign. Cicero uses the legion very much for political purposes, so it gets a much better write-up than Alaudi. It doesn't seem to be have this ambiguous element. These may not be true Romans with Alaudi, but he talks about it. Let's see. Where are we? Yeah. So in 20th of December, 44 BC, Philippics 3:6, not the extra one. Cicero talks about, we cannot be silent regarding the Legio Martia. For what single person has ever been braver, who more friendly to the res publica than the whole Legio Martia? Having decided as it did that Marcus Antonius was an enemy of the Roman people, it refused to be an ally of his madness. It abandoned a consul it would certainly not have done had it judged him to be a real consul. Now, Cicero's, to say the least, casting a very positive veil over what had really happened there. Martia, 4th Legion, and several others are ones that are brought over by Mark Antony from Macedonia to Italy to create an army for himself as he's anticipating civil war, building up a position. Encouraged by Cicero and others, more and more members of the Senate have turned against him. He's lost power there. Octavian, the young Caesar, has appeared. He is proclaiming himself to be Caesar's heir politically and not just in terms of his private fortune, his private estate. He is raising money from Caesar's former officers, bankers, backers, starting to raise troops from Caesar's veterans. He has sent agents to the camp in Italy, where these troops are mustering, as Antony continues to ferry troops across the Adriatic. And his agents blacken Antony's reputation, but they promise 500 denarii with 5,000 to follow. So more than a year's pay, more than double a year's pay straight away, and the equivalent of more than a decade's worth in the future. 2 legions, plus some auxiliaries, plus some of the elephants that have brought their defect. Antony tries to deal with the situation, harangues the men, arrests ringleaders, executes them. He's there, his wife Fulvia is there. Cicero talks about her being spattered with the blood of these men who are executed. It doesn't work. He misreads the situation. Most of these men were probably strangers to Antony. Whatever his military record before, he hadn't had much to do with these particular units. And it's hard to act against Caesar's heir, that Octavian's presenting himself as, but also Caesar's heir coming with a really fat checkbook and being very lavish with it. So Antony tries to deal with it by force. It doesn't work, drives people off. But the rest of the army, he does keep other legions that do stay with him, Alaudi and a couple of others. So, right, let's look briefly at the campaign. And we won't go into great detail because, again, it's quite a complicated story, and I know this talk is already going on far longer than anticipated, than planned, as usual. So you have very tentative steps against Mark Antony by a majority in the Senate during the course of 44. Cicero encourages them from a distance, so do the conspirators, but all the main conspirators have left Rome. So Brutus and Cassius and Decimus Brutus have gone, in part because they're magistrates, so they've got provinces, so they're going out to take on commands. Octavian has Legio Martia and Legio 4. Now, Legio 4 is the other one that's come across from Macedonia. So there are 2 legions that have been embodied all the way through, were in training, under preparation to go with Caesar on his expeditions. He also raises a 7th and possibly an 8th from, 7 and 8 rather, from recalled veterans. Now, how quickly you can call up your veterans and turn them into a legion is, again, something we can't pin down. We don't really have the information for. You've got to arm them. You've got to organise them. You've got to get the books going again, the organisation. You've got to get the transport, the tents, the supply system, the baggage animals, all of these things. There's a lot to go on. And again, you wonder, when he reforms Legio 7, the one that had served with such distinction in Gaul under Caesar, then do you initially have 1,000 men or so, and then you hope to build it up with more recruits as they come in, as you go around the other colonies, appeal people in. So Martia and Legio 4 are probably reasonably strong legions. Whether they're at their full theoretical strength is another matter, but it was strong enough to be considered ready to go off on campaign. Whereas the other ones, it may be a process that's ongoing. The Senate has raised 4 new legions, completely new. Now, it's difficult for them to get experienced officers. They have Hirtius and Panzer as the consuls. Hirtius is one of Caesar's former officers. Panzer has a connection as well. Hirtius has served in Gaul in the Civil War. He is probably the author of the 8th book of the Gallic War and some of the, maybe one at least, of the Alexandrian War, of the books of the Civil War that continue on. And you could argue about the African War. Not the Spanish one, but that seems to be by a different author. So he's someone who must have done that quite recently, writing those up. You know, that's all happened fairly on. But he is willing to obey the Senate. He clearly doesn't like, or is not willing to side with Mark Antony. You have 4 new legions raised and divided between the consuls, but these are raw recruits. So these are legions raised in whatever is the normal way for this period. They don't seem to have a lot of veterans. Whether they were able to attract that many experienced officers that would help you to train, organise, do all of these things, get things going, hard to say. But bear in mind, Antony's looking for experienced officers, Octavian's looking for experienced officers. They have more money than the Senate in each case, and more status. So you're probably getting, again, you're probably not getting the pick of the bunch who are willing to serve there. Antony's got 5th Alaudi, he's got 2nd, he's got the 35th, and he reinforces their loyalty by promising them ever bigger rewards. So again, he's been outbid for Martia and Legio 4 by Octavian. He isn't going to let that happen again. And Brutus and Cassius will do the same thing. All the warlords in this period bribe their men, promise them great bounties if they will stay loyal, if they will fight. Decimus Brutus is in northern Italy at Mutina. Antony besieges him with his army, blockades him. There's lots of interesting stuff about carrier pigeons going back and forth, people sneaking through the lines, swimming, all this sort of thing. Again, can't go into that today. So Hirtius and Panzer are ordered by the Senate to go north to relieve Decimus Brutus. Octavian, with effectively his private army, the Legion 7 he's already raised, the Legion 8 that he is raising from veterans, and that doesn't seem to take part in the campaign at this stage. It may not be quite ready. Though again, it may be that it just doesn't get mentioned. And Martia and Legio 4. He places these and himself under the Senate's banner, basically. And the Senate, in a most irregular manner, give him proconsular imperium. He's a private citizen, he's a kid, he's not old enough to be a member of the Senate, let alone be elected to anything. So this is extraordinary, but it's rather like Pompey appearing in the Sullan Civil War. When somebody turns up with several legions, you can either spurn them, in which case they're going to fight you, or they might join your enemy and fight you, or you can think, well, better they're with us than with anybody else, so let's accept this. I don't like it, but this is the best thing. And of course you have the famous laudandum adolescentum, monandum tollendum, the Cicero comment. Let's praise the young man, reward him, discard him. The idea is that he is not as dangerous as Mark Antony because he is just a kid. He doesn't have the political connections, the political reputation, the political savvy. Antony is the danger, Antony is the man you hate, Antony is the man you're directing all this spleen against in the Philippics. So let's use him to fight against him, and then we can marginalise him, get rid of him easily enough because he isn't that much of a threat. So they go north. He is in theory under the command of the consuls, but he does now have imperium of his own, power of his own, and he donates in a sense some of the units to the consuls, because this is the big distinction that's drawn again and again in the campaigns. The 4 legions of recruits that have been formed by the 2 consuls are very shaky. These are not disciplined, these are not well trained, they have little or no experience, probably even few experienced officers. So you have troops that have numbers but not much else. And the units that really matter are the veterans. Now Antony also has an advantage in cavalry and auxiliary troops. We don't get much mention of these elephants that have appeared and have been brought with great trouble back from Macedonia. Again, part of the preparations for Caesar's campaigns, presumably. They don't seem to play that much of a role in what follows. The cavalry are significant, but again, cavalry are only suitable for certain types of terrain, and that will be not the case in the Forum Gallorum. So, the two consuls split up, and Pansa approaches Antony first. Octavian follows. Hirtius sends back to join Octavian and join Pansa the Legio Martia, which has been sort of donated to him by Octavian, but again, Octavian's the one who's paying them, who's promised them all these things, so they're still very much his men. And also the Praetorian cohort. It's described as Caesar's Praetorian cohort, presumably one formed to guard Octavian himself, and they will play, as we mentioned before, a significant role in the battle. So they approach, they move towards them. Antony knows they're coming, but he knows that numbers are on the enemy's side. The enemy have got 7 legions, he's got 3. 4 of the legions the enemy have got are not very good and are very inexperienced, but nevertheless they've got 3 good ones, which matches his 3 good ones. He's got an advantage probably in auxiliary troops, in cavalry, but only under some circumstances will that really matter. So Antony, in a sense, is in that strategic situation where he needs to divide the enemy or fight them separately to have a best chance of winning, because he doesn't have numbers to match theirs. So conveniently, and in part perhaps a reflection of having to improvise all the logistics. Remember, we've talked about that and the equipping of Octavian's men. Hirtius and Pansa are having to do exactly the same thing. All of this is thrown together. All of this is a bit of a lash-up done at the last minute. Nothing is really that ready. And neither Hirtius nor Pansa have extensive experience of serving in independent command. They've been subordinates before. So, these are not... And they've assembled an army quickly. They've only taken up office at the start of the year. And it's actually a rarity. It's been a long time since consuls have fought on campaign. Normally, since Sulla, you spend your year as consul, as praetor in Rome, and then you go out to a province afterwards. It's only the sort of thing that tends to happen in civil wars. So, Pansa was to join Hirtius's camp, and again we go back to Galba, his letters to Cicero. He talks about he's with him, he'd gone 100 miles to meet him and to speed him up, basically. Antony leads out 2 legions, according to Hirtius, the 2nd and the 35th, 2 Praetorian cohorts, one of his own, that's another of Silanus, part of his Evocati. This strength he advanced to meet us, thinking there were only 4 legions of recruits. But the previous nights, Hirtius had sent us with Legio Martia, which used to be under my command, and the 2 Praetorian cohorts for our better security on the march. So Antony thinks he can take on just the 4 inexperienced units and hit them hard with his veterans. In fact, it's a tougher nut to crack than he anticipated, because Legio Martia has been rushed forward. So Appian talks about when Pansa was drawing near with his army, Caesar and Hirtius sent Carsuleus to him with Caesar's Praetorian cohort and the Legio Martia to assist him in passing through the defile near Forum Gallorum, where the road is restricted by marshes and other ground. Again, have a look at the map, and we'll come back to this, where they're pushing forward to try and get to Mutina. Notice, in Appian's account, it isn't Suplicius Galba who's in charge. And Galba is a little bit vague when you read the details. He's a senior officer, but he's sort of implying I'm the main man and I'm in charge and I've always been in the past. But Appian has somebody else, this Carsuleus. Antony hadn't occupied the defiles. It served no other purpose than hinder the enemy. Eager to fight, having no chance to win distinction with his cavalry because the ground was marshy, cut by ditches, placed his 2 best legions in ambush in the march, where they were concealed by the reeds and where the road, which had been thrown up artificially, was narrow. Carsuleus and Pansa hurried through the defile by night. At daybreak, with only the Martia and 5 other cohorts, they entered upon the high road above mentioned, which was still free of enemies, and looked over the marsh on either side. So again, go back to Galba. He has it a little bit differently. When Antony's cavalry came in sight, there was no holding back the Martia and the Praetorian cohorts. We started to follow them willy-nilly, since we'd not been able to hold them back. Antony kept his forces at Forum Gallorum, wanting to conceal the fact that he had the legions. He only showed us his cavalry and light armed troops. Panzer saw the legion advancing contrary to his intention. He ordered 2 legions of recruits to follow him. Having traversed a narrow route through marsh and woodlands, we drew up battle line of 12 cohorts. So here you've got something different. It's in Galba's account, they've seen the outposts of the enemy, they've seen cavalry, they've seen light infantry, and the veteran unit, Legio Martia, is going straight for them, will not be held back. So here you've got something interesting where this is the veteran unit, but actually it's not that tightly disciplined. Whether it's just the men, whether it's the officers as well, they're keen to get on with it, they're keen to fight, and they attack without being given specific orders. That's unless there's a confusion over the orders, because again, this is an army that's been thrown together and doesn't really know what it's doing yet. It's not a practiced team. But that's an interesting difference between the two accounts. And Panzer then sort of partly commits. He sends 2 legions, so half the 4 he's got. But again, given that they've all been on the march, the other 2 might be some way back at this point. So it's also a question of who realistically can get there within a reasonable time. With Appian, they've gone through by night, and then they don't see enemies. But then, according to Appian, there was a suspicious agitation of the rushes, then a gleam here and there of shield and helmet, and Antony's Praetorian cohort suddenly showed itself directly in front. The Martia, surrounded on all sides and having no way to escape, ordered the new levies, if they came up, not to join in the fight, lest they should cause confusion by their inexperience. So it's, keep out of the way, Sonny. We'll handle this. Again, in Appian's version, quite how they do that, Galba is saying that the new recruits haven't got there yet. But again, what's going on? So Praetorians of Caesar confronted the Praetorians of Antony. The other troops divided themselves in 2 parts and advanced into the march on either side, one commanded by Panzer, the other by Carsuleus. Thus there were 2 battles in the marshes, and neither division could see the other by reason of the elevated road, while along the road itself the 2 Praetorian cohorts fought another battle of their own. So come back to Galba. We started to follow. Antony kept his forces at Forum Gallorum, wanted to conceal the fact that he had the legions. When he shows the cavalry and light infantry. When Panzer saw the legion advance, contrary to intention, ordered the recruits to follow. Having traversed a narrow route, we drew up the battle line of 12 cohorts. 2 legions had not yet come up. So again, that distinction. Appian, you've got people saying, well, don't come in and interfere. Galba is saying, well, they haven't arrived yet anyway. Suddenly, Antony led his forces out of the village. So here they're concealed in a built-up area rather than in the reeds of the marshes, and drew them up and immediately engaged. Both sides at first fought as fiercely as men could, but the right wing, where I was placed with 8 cohorts of the Martia, again, it's not mentioned by Appian, threw back Antony's 35th at the first charge, advanced more than half a mile from its original position to the line. Cavalry then tried to surround our wings, started to retire, light-armed against the Moorish horse. This is the bit, again, that's always found very interesting, found himself in the thick of the Antonians, Antony some distance behind him, gallops away towards the new recruits, is nearly mistaken for an enemy, but manages to get recognised and not killed. So that's very much the account of Galba focusing on his actions, implying, well, I'm in charge of this part of the battle line, and I'm in charge of 8 cohorts, which when you've only got 12 committed is 2/3 of the entire army. So, back to Appian. The Antonians were determined to punish the Martia for desertion as being traitors to themselves. The Martia were equally determined to punish the Antonians for condoning the slaughter of their comrades at Brundisium. Recognising in each other the flower of either army, they hoped to decide the whole war by this single engagement. The other side was moved by shame lest its 2 legions should be beaten by 1. The other by ambition that its single legion should overcome the 2. Thus, urged on by animosity and ambition, they assailed each other, considering this their own affair rather than that of the generals. Being veterans, they raised no battle cry, since they could not expect to terrify each other, nor in the engagement did they utter a sound, either as victors or vanquished. As there could be neither flanking nor charging amid marshes and ditches, they met together in close order, and since neither could dislodge the other, they locked together with their swords as in a wrestling match. This passage is one of these rare occasions where you get a detailed, if admittedly quite flowery description of 2 infantry lines, in this case 2 Roman infantry lines, clashing. And some of it does seem exaggerated, but it's interesting. So no blow, together as their swords, as in a wrestling match, no blow missed its mark. There were wounds and slaughter, but no cries, only groans. seems a little bit unlikely that they're fighting in silence. About the sense of grunting, but you feel battle cries are a big part of ancient warfare, that at least some of this, and there'd be people shouting orders, encouragement. But again, what Appian is characterizing, and presumably one of his sources characterized, is this sort of silent, deadly, determined combat. These are proper soldiers who know what they're doing. They're not messing about. They're just getting on and trying to kill each other. When one fell, he was instantly carried away and another took his place. Again, you get mentions of this sort of thing, of casualties being removed, wounded from the front and replaced by others, but it's quite rare you get this sort of detail. It seems to be something that you assume is happening normally, but again, usually it's just assumed. They needed neither admonition nor encouragement, since experience made each one his own general. When they were overcome by fatigue, they drew apart from each other a brief space to take breath, as in gymnastic games. Then they rushed again to the encounter. Now that's interesting, because I'm one of these people, Phil Sabin and others have talked about the idea that combat is so exhausting and stressful that you can't fight hand to hand for 30 minutes, let alone hours on end. And that therefore when you have these long combats, there are periods where the two sides draw back and are a few yards apart, drawing breath, getting their breath back, trying to get their spirits up again enough to step forward and renew the combat, rather than a constant thing, the sort of Hollywood battle where everybody fights it out till nearly everybody's dead, and then it's all over in 5 minutes or so. Amazement took possession of the new levies who'd come out to beheld such deeds done with such precision and in such silence. All put forth superhuman effort. Praetorians of Caesar perished the last man. Those of the Martia who were under Carsuleus got the better of those opposed to them, who gave way not in disgraceful rout, but little by little. Those under Panzer were likewise in difficulties, but they held out with equal bravery, and on both sides till Panzer was wounded in the side by a javelin, carried off the field. Again, doesn't appear in Galba's account, at least not at this point. So again, we may wonder, has Appian got the timing right? And of course, again, it's Carsuleus, not Galba, who's doing this. And presumably that success, is that the equivalent of when Galba says that his 8 cohorts of Legio Martia push back the 35th Legion for some distance, and half a mile or so? Is that what we're talking about here? Probably, but again, it's how do you link different accounts? Can you just cut and paste them together? Then his soldiers retired at first step by step, but afterwards they turned and hurried as if in flight. When the new levies saw this, they fled in disorder with loud cries to their camp, which the Quaestor Torquatus had put in readiness for them while the battle was in progress, pending it might be needed. So again, back to Galba. On the Via Aemilia itself, Caesar's Praetorian cohort was stationed. There was a long struggle. So again, Galba's emphasising prolonged, tough fighting. The weaker flank, consisting of 2 cohorts of the Martia and 1 Praetorian cohort, begins to give ground, which is what Appian's talking about. They're being surrounded by cavalry, not mentioned by Appian, which is Antony's strongest arm. When all our ranks had withdrawn, I started to retreat to the camp, the last to do so. Having won the battle as he considered, Antony thought he would take the camp. When he arrived, he lost a number of men there and achieved nothing. Back to Appian. The new levies crowded into the camp confusedly, although they were Italians as well as the Martia. So much more does training contribute to bravery than race. That's an interesting comment. He's saying legionaries don't fight well because they're Romans, because they're Italians. They fight well because they're well trained. And it's one of those easy conceits that many nations have in history. We win because we're British, because we're Australian, because we're German, because we're American, whatever it might be. The idea that you could just give somebody a gun and they go off and fight and win because their father's generation, their grandfather's generation or before did that. It is a nonsense, but it's something a lot of people readily believe. Martia, for fear of shame, did not enter the camp and range themselves near it. Although fatigued, they were still furious and ready to fight to the bitter end if anybody should attack them. Antony refrained from attacking the Martia on being a troublesome business, fell upon the new levies and made great slaughter. So, back to Galba. Having heard what had happened, Hirtius with 20 veteran cohorts met Antony on his way back to his camp, completely destroyed or routed his forces on the very ground of the previous engagement. Antony withdrew with his horse to the camp at Mutina about 10 o'clock at night. Hirtius then returned to the camp from which Panzer had marched out, where he'd left the 2 legions, which had been assaulted by Antony. Antony lost a great part of his veteran troops, but we've had heavy loss in the Praetorians and Legio Martia, captured 2 eagles, 60 standards of Antony have been brought in. It's a victory. So no mention of Panzer having a javelin in his side there, no mention of Carsuleus. So back to Appian, who tells it slightly differently. When Hirtius near Mutina heard of this fight at a distance of 60 stades, that's 7.5 miles, he hurried thither with the other legion that had deserted from Antony, so Legio 4. So he's not. So again, that's what they've got left. We don't hear about Octavian's Legio 7 this early on, and it may be that they're not ready either and join the campaign later on. Already evening, victorious Antonians returning singing hymns of triumph. When they were in loose order, Hirtius made his appearance in perfect order with his legion complete and fresh. Antonians got themselves in line under compulsion, performed against this foe many splendid deeds of valour. Being wearied by their recent exertions, they were overcome by the fresh army opposed to them. The greater part of them were slain in this encounter by Hirtius. Now this implies that you've just got one legion fighting them, so that in fact they're outnumbered but they're fresh, which of course is a very significant thing. Although that Hirtius did not pursue, apprehensive of the marshy ground. Darkness was coming on, allowed them to escape. Wide stretch of marshland was filled with arms, corpses, wounded men, half-dead men, some were even unhurt, mistrusted their strength by reason of fatigue. And again, another interesting little detail here. Antony's cavalry, as many as he had with him, went to the assistance of his infantry, collected them through the entire night. Some they put on horseback in their own... Where are we? No, can't find my continuation page of this. Oh, sorry, own places. Others they took on the horses with themselves, while others they urged to take hold of the horses' tails, run along with them, so secure their safety. I generally think the mane's probably a bit safer than the tail, but again, it depends. Thus were Antony's forces, after he had fought splendidly, destroyed by the coming of Hirtius. He encamped without entrenchments in a village near the plain named Forum Gallorum. Antony and Pansa each lost about 1/2 of their men. The whole of Caesar's Praetorian cohort perished. The loss of Hirtius was slight. So again, Galba doesn't give us any friendly casualties other than saying they're serious. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, basically. This tough fight means we've lost a lot. A cohort being annihilated seems unlikely unless they were trapped, unable to escape. Normally there'll be some survivors, but heavy losses. Seriously depleted, and perhaps to the point where it's no longer an effective cohort at the end of this, with killed and wounded. Again, remember Appian's talked about wounded being pulled back from the front ranks, some of whom may have been evacuated fully. So, as normally you've probably got more wounded than dead, though some of the wounded may have been left behind, may have been killed by the Antonians or not. So you have there two parallel accounts where there are some interesting correlations and other bits that seem completely different. It seems really a question of perspective in many cases, but also source material. So let's make a few points about this. On the one hand, this is a fairly fluid battle. Armies deploy from the march in fairly hasty battle lines and fight each other. As far as we can tell, Pansa and Hirtius and Casuleius, they form their cohorts in a single line, at least initially, and they're waiting for other troops to come up. We don't know how Antony's deployed. But again, the normal Roman emphasis on 3 lines of cohorts, at least 2, but 3 is normal, and sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or more. That's not there. It's fought in difficult, restrictive terrain because of the marshes. The road is on a bank. So you've got the raised roadway, you've got marshes, you've got a town, a village, Forum Gallorum. Beyond it, doesn't seem to be fighting there, but Antony's men, according to one version, hide there. In the other version, they hide in the marshes. Perhaps it's a mixture. Again, perhaps it depends on perspective. Galba has the advantage of being an eyewitness, but obviously he could only see what he could see. He could only then might have heard other accounts as well, but seems to emphasize very much his perspective on the battle. But he's obviously much closer to it and was there, whereas Appian is relying on sources who may or may not have been there. Style of command is very direct. This is not a battle of particularly subtle or grand tactical manoeuvres. But again, because it's fairly rare, it's very much an encounter battle. Indeed, really 2 encounter battles, because Antony is trying to ambush and chooses his position to fight in the first place. The other side deploys to face him. Some of their armies still coming up to join them. Fights the battle there. So it's not fought on ground of their choice. Antony wins that, chases them back. Hirtius comes up with Legio 4, and Antony has to fight a battle again. not in circumstances or on ground of his choice. So you really have two encounter battles. It's fairly fluid, it's fairly confused. You could argue that perhaps this means it's more chaotic than a battle begun where both sides have camped next to each other for a while and deploy in ordered battle lines and then begin very deliberately. Not that those were not likely to be chaotic as well, but this might be particularly chaotic. In the style of command, Galba, of course, has this. He's around there. He ends up behind the enemy line. So again, it's not a solid line of battle. He hasn't gone through that. It's units, pockets of men, groups of men with gaps between them, emphasizing the fluidity. But again, perhaps not just because of that, but actually because that's fairly normal. And Antony's behind him. So Antony is very much doing same sort of leadership style as a Caesar in this tactical sense. And one day I will get on to my talk on Roman generals and how they control a battle, do that in more detail. And the impression is if Panzer is, Appian's right, and is wounded there, he certainly is wounded and dies during the course of the campaign, as is Hirtius. So you have battlefield management, but also close supervision, encouragement, generals riding around, trying to be in the right place at the right time, moving around the battle line, trying to get things going. Galba twice mentions Antony's cavalry threatening the flanks of his troops. Now, whether there's areas beyond the marsh where they can do that, or whether they've gone right around the marsh, they're threatening it's a bigger outflanking movement. We don't know who's ordering this. Again, it's not something that's really featured in Appian. Appian emphasizes veteran soldier meets veteran soldier in a slogging match, and it's a soldier's battle. Every man, every soldier is his own general, that sort of thing. The style of fighting, you have these pauses, these lulls, this determined fighting. The formations, I say, we don't seem to have the successive lines, the reserves that we'd normally have. The orders are you to deploy, to form up in the first place, though again that's fairly improvised in what space is available and who's in which spot at the time when it begins. So it's improvised. So the Panzer's army is unbalanced. You have 8 cohorts one side, only 4 the other, and you have one on the road, and they seem to be fighting in and around the road itself. So how wide this bank was. Something to bear in mind. I mean, the terrain is particularly significant in this battle, but so often you will see battle plans in my books, in anybody's books, of Pharsalus, of elsewhere, where you might have a river or something, you might have one hill, but basically it's this bowling green, this vast expanse that's perfectly flat. Real life isn't like that. Real landscape is not like that. And very often battles are being fought in farmland. So you'd have drainage ditches, fences, crops, vines, things like that, things that can be quite serious obstacles, as well as the fact that the ground isn't going to be perfectly flat. So I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but there was an old, I think it was right at the beginning of the Peter Connolly's Roman army, picture of Pydna, where he was partly to illustrate the pike phalanx breaking out, but he sort of said, these tree stumps and little banks and things in the sense. Reality is a lot more confused. We impose an order where we make things neat and flat, and the formation's perfect and all this sort of thing. The odds are that there was local sort of macro geography, topography plays a major role in these battles. It does in any period. That farm wall, that little ditch, that little rise, that stream, these things that aren't big enough and are quite local in their role, but they're very important to the people who are fighting there. These are not just ignored. Simply because our sources don't give us those sorts of details, and we can so rarely locate a battle, ancient battlefield that precisely, let alone then decide what was the topography like on the day of the battle. We sometimes ignore these things and simplify everything. So you've got that. It's more confused, but while you could again say, well, this is an encounter battle, it's unusually chaotic, again, I think come back and consider that maybe the pitched battles are rather more chaotic than sometimes we tend to imagine. Another interesting parallel, you have the bit where Galba's maintaining that the troops can't be held back. They've seen Antony's men and they're just going for it. Legia Martia, so you've just got to give in. That's interesting because in the Thapsus campaign. In the account, again, not written by Julius Caesar. It's probably not the sort of thing that Caesar himself would talk about, although I suppose he does a little bit at Gergovia when he says his troops don't listen to the order to reform and retire, that he gives by trumpet signal. And they push on, and that explains the fact that things go badly and he gets defeated. But at Thapsus, he's described as riding up and down the lines, bawling out to the men not to get excited, not to start when the men want to go and fight for it. They want to get it over with, they want to attack the Pompeians, let's get on with it, let's kill the so-and-sos, and let's go home. And Caesar tries to restrain them until the soldiers pressure a trumpeter to sound the signal to advance. That's taken up by others, and the army goes forward. Caesar tries to restrain them, gives up, gives the order to command, and follows with them and does his general's job. So discipline is something we'll talk about in a Roman context another day in more detail. You have this stereotype fed by some of our literary sources of the sort of iron discipline of the Roman legions that can turn them almost into automata. The sources do not reflect that, even with experienced and veteran units. Again, civil wars perhaps particularly chaotic, particularly prone to the soldiers doing what they want to do because the commanders have to keep them on their side, but it may not be just that. There may be more of an element to that. And the enthusiasm, the eagerness with which they attack is reflected by how hard they fight. So you're trying to control things, but you also realize there are some things beyond your control, and there are elements where you've just got to let it happen. So that's quite interesting. Again, you've got Galba behind the enemy lines. You've got the perspective of the individual. And also, he's trying to get credit for this. So he's writing a letter to get in first. This is my version of our victory. A lot of it's down to me. I'm the hero of the day. Obviously, so is Legio Martia and the Praetorians and all this sort of thing. Emphasis on the enthusiasm of the veterans, determined fighting, but also, you get when Martia drives back Antony's men half a mile, according to Galba, then the long retreat. So these armies go back and forth. It's not just a fight, clash together, one side breaks, gets slaughtered by the vengeful pursuers, and that's it. Again, it's a lot more tentative, there's a lot more movement than we might allow for. Particularly savage fight between the Praetorians. You've got all the veteran stuff in Appian, the silent combat, that sort of thing. So there's a sense of a snapshot, and again we come back to some of the things we talked about of eyewitnesses and the problems of using these sources, but also the advantages of them. You could see it in later periods, Waterloo being a prime example. But also, armies are not quite what we expect. So this is not rigid Roman troops, rigid Roman legions, perfectly disciplined, that always deploy in the triplex acies, always fight in a certain way and fight with determination. They do fight with determination. They are Roman legions, but the way they behave isn't as simple as that, as the stereotype. Now, another interesting thing that I may have quoted before, I can't remember, I've lost track of some of the accounts I've given. Right. Cicero. Okay, we've got somewhere. Yeah, here we go. So this is from Philippics 14, delivered 21st of April 43 BC, so a week after the battle. And Cicero argues, whereas the valour of the legion has proved worthy of the most noble generals, the Senate will make good the promises heretofore made to our legions and armies. Whereas the Legio Martia has been foremost in coming into conflict with the enemy and has contended so successfully with superior numbers of the enemy as to slay many and to take some prisoners. So he goes on to propose a monument be erected to Legio Martia. We don't know whether this ever happened. And then the rewards which the Senate has appointed for the soldiers to be paid to the parents, children, wives, and brothers of those that have fallen in this war for the sake of their country. Same rewards be given to them as they should have been given had they survived their victory to the soldiers themselves, who become victors by death. That's interesting in so many ways. First, because it's a reminder this is not the army of the Principate. This is not the army where soldiers are forbidden from marrying, or at least having a legal marriage, even though we know many of them do raise families. This is an army where the soldiers have dependents, both old and young. So again, your veterans are not necessarily that elderly. They've got living parents. And that the state is willing to say, these are all the things we promised you, and we've been promising you a lot to take our side in a civil war against Mark Antony when you had been under his command at one point, under his brother's command. So we're not only promising all that, but even now we've won. The war is not fully over. Antony's in retreat, but nevertheless, this is a great victory. We're going to keep on. We want to keep on encouraging you. We're actually going to fulfill our side of the bargain and get this. Again, whether anybody ever got these promised rewards is another matter. We simply don't know. But it's a reminder that our stereotype of the sort of the single, the unmarried Roman soldier, or the one who can't contract a legal marriage, belongs to the Principate. Don't transfer it back to this earlier period. These are Roman citizens under arms, and they can do all the things Roman citizens can do. So they have families, obviously particularly the veterans. And it may well be that one of the reasons why Augustus brings in the restriction on marriage is that he doesn't want the state to be obliged to provide for families and children and all this sort of thing because of the sheer cost of it. The cost of the army is a big deal in the Augustan regime, hence the extension of service to 25 years from 20. So that's an interesting little closing point that you have. Again, it's a reminder. These are Roman soldiers, these are Roman legionaries in Roman legions. They're moving towards a professional, more permanent force, but it isn't the army of the Principate yet. It doesn't do things that way. And that battles, when we have slightly more detailed accounts, can suggest more local tactics, small-scale tactics, more confusion, more role of officers at all levels than we necessarily get in the broader descriptions of a big battle that tends to make something like Pharsalus fairly simple. Probably not, it doesn't mean that these things aren't happening in those battles as well, if not necessarily to the same extent everywhere in more ordered situations where the battle lines are more ordered, but you've probably got a more complicated picture there. And you drop down. Again, Caesar's perspective on one of his battles is very much that of a commander, the main tactical movements, and then some simple sort of summaries. This is why my men won here, or this is why things went badly and were tough here. If we had accounts from Pharsalus, from the battle against Ariovistus, written by a subordinate officer like Galba, written by a centurion, written by an ordinary soldier, the perspective would be very different, just as it is in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries when we do have personal accounts from those sorts of levels. What you see, what you experience, what's important to you changes, but all those experiences go together to making up how the battle is decided and how it happens. So anyway, as usual, this has turned out to be far longer than I'd planned, but hopefully, even though Forum Gallorum is less famous than many battles, it's I've shown that it's an interesting thing to go and look at, go and consider. We'll do more battles in the months to come. I'm not quite sure what's coming next week. It might be the second part, the conclusion of the Trajan's Column talk, the survey of that. We'll see how things are going. There are several things underway that I'm hoping to get in during the course of July, but again, school holidays starting, all that sort of thing. It's fitting it in with other commitments and making sure that things happen. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.